Welcome to S&C Sidebar, where we talk with our different partners about some of the most interesting legal issues they've seen in their careers and what they are seeing on the horizon, among other topics. I'm Jay Clayton, and today I'm joined by Matthew Goodman. Matthew is a partner in S&C's Mergers and Acquisitions Group. He has extensive experience representing clients across various industries, domestically and internationally, with a focus on M&A and private equity. His practice involves joint ventures, stock purchases, asset acquisitions, and take-private transactions. Matt also regularly advises on corporate governance matters. He has been a partner at the firm since 2020. Good afternoon, Matt.
Good to see you, Jay.
Let's kick right off with, what are some of the most interesting matters that you've worked on in your career?
I would say the really complicated cross-border M&A deals with lots of different components, whether they're security laws issues, exec comp issues and tax issues that don't really hang together, or one jurisdiction says one thing and a different jurisdiction says another thing. But it's also been for some of the crisis matters for some of our clients, whether they've dealt with a restatement, CFO separation, but working with clients long-term and dealing with things that they have to deal with on the day-to-day, not just transactions.
Yeah, there's a real dichotomy there. Transactions are voluntary. Rarely is somebody forcing you to do a transaction. Crises, you have to deal with them. If you're faced with a restatement, or you're faced with a regulatory action, or you're faced with something else, it's not voluntary. You have to act.
You have to act, and your clients have to trust your judgment.
I find it actually much easier to handle what people refer to as crisis matters if you've done a bunch of transaction matters with the same team.
Yeah, they trust you, and they know that you can bring in all the experts and the resources that the firm have. And that's actually what makes it really fun. You get a bunch of people with different perspectives and expertise and try to bring them all to bear.
Yeah, and you talked about cross-border transactions in that light. It's becoming increasingly the case, which is kind of remarkable given globalization, that each jurisdiction is flexing its muscles more and more in transactions. At least that's my perspective compared to 10 and 20 years ago.
They're communicating a lot more with each other, which means that they're identifying more and more issues, which makes deals more complex. And the other thing that a number of the regulatory regimes and agencies are doing is they want to be the last ones to approve or clear a deal, which actually makes things take longer. And then as deals take longer, you need to actually address those potential issues in the contract. They have to run a day-to-day business. And so having the right amount of flexibility to take that into account is important.
Yeah, you almost have to project the level of regulatory coordination that's going to take place, or lack thereof.
Lack thereof is true. And oftentimes understanding the atmospherics in advance and not being on your back foot with whether it's politics, different labor organizations, and getting ahead of that with the narrative and actually talking to those constituencies in advance of the announcement. Oftentimes, a key constituency doesn't want to be reading about a deal when the announcement press release comes out.
Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We often talk about the Sullivan Cromwell generalist approach, and I'll editorialize. It doesn't mean that somebody is good at every aspect of the law or experienced at every aspect of law. But I think it does mean, and you just reflected this in your comments, it does mean that you know enough about the entire landscape of a transaction to identify when you need to bring other resources in or when other resources are more appropriate. Can you comment on that and how you've developed the ability to look across a transaction and know what resources are needed?
Yeah, I think early on at S&C you're exposed to everything and anything, and you get trained to be curious about things, trained to be curious about the issues and what your clients are all about, and not just the legal issues and having legal acumen, but understanding commercial issues, understanding the narrative around these things, and also understanding that There are lots of really, really smart, talented people, and being able to work with them as a group and getting the best answer for the client, not just your best answer from a narrow perspective, is ultimately what comes across really early on.
Okay, well, I'm going to tap into that curiosity. With that curious hat on, what are some of the recent high-level developments in the mergers and acquisition space that you think clients should be watching?
So you mentioned the regulatory landscape, more and more focus across the globe on FDI and other regulatory regimes, in addition to the antitrust layer, which is front and center for a lot of people in the US marketplace. Those are critical. Deals are more complex and taking longer. Interest rate environment, obviously, inflation, understandings for macroeconomic influences is important. Another thing I've been keeping a close eye on is the pendulum swinging as far as the Delaware judiciary is concerned, and whether alternative jurisdictions do start to pull companies in. There's been a lot of noise, I would say, coming out of some of the Delaware decisions over the last couple of years, but the courts have been scrutinizing deals carefully, which is their main function. And you saw the legislature respond in a way. And so we have to keep an eye on that, because certain transactions are probably harder than they used to be. But I think the system is working. You just got to keep a close eye on things.
I agree that the system is working. I do think that people sometimes forget that shareholders do not have a fiduciary duty to other shareholders, and directors have a fiduciary duty to all shareholders, and that the incidence of responsibility, in my view, should first be placed on the directors, and the incidence of authority should follow that responsibility. And sometimes we put the responsibility on the directors and the authority on disparate shareholders without really considering what that means.
I generally agree. The other transformation probably that's happened over the last 25, 30 years is shareholder makeup.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot of institutional investors. Retail investors are not actively following companies as they used to. And so you have this consolidation of what you may view as passive investors, and then you have a handful of active hedge funds or agitators.
And don't get me wrong, I think having an activist investor can be very healthy for a company.
They serve a very important function, right? They're out there trying to stimulate a good economic result for them, which is also probably a good economic result for the other shareholders.
And they can make directors focus on their fiduciary duty. But at the end of the day, that decision-making, I believe, should be with the fiduciaries. So speaking of those fiduciaries and they're your clients, what do you think are the most effective ways to foster a good relationship with members of boards of directors, founder owners, executives?
Knowing what makes them tick and what their companies do tick, and knowing what their companies do, and having a sense of what's around the corner, and giving them the tools to make informed decisions. The process and the decision-making process, oftentimes under the Delaware fiduciary regime, is critical. And having them think about things and discuss things as they're developing, not an after-the-fact approach, it gives people the comfort to sleep well at night that they ran a thoughtful and deliberate process on any key decision.
That's great. I'll switch gears one more time, and that is not talking about clients and developing relationships with clients, but for our associates and young lawyers who may be listening to this, what areas should they focus on? How should they develop their careers?
So one thing is easy to say, which is excellent work and taking ownership and being responsible, understanding that the firm wants people to succeed. And whether that means as a partner or future partner, whether that means as being the next general counsel or doing something else, people around here want to be mentors and want to be mentored. One of the things that people often say as young associates is, oh, it's impossible to make partner. Some of my most important mentors from day one always made it seem that it was a real possibility, and was all about work ethic and being in a meritocracy and not about anything else. And I think that gets lost on people sometimes.
Well, Matt, it's been terrific to catch up with you. Congratulations on all your success, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe.